Tonight I am speaking to you from a room the light has almost abandoned, and as I say those words, I feel the absurdity of my own fear. I am a man who has spent his life inside libraries and archives, who has held in his hands parchment that outlived empires, who has seen prophecies rise and fall like the tides of fashion. I know what it means to misread a symbol, to project anxiety onto ink and dust, to see patterns where there are only accidents and stains. I know all of that, and still my hands are not steady as I sit before this old icon of Michael, darkened by centuries of breath and candle smoke, watching the single flame breathe on the metal halo that crowns his head. The boards creak under my chair. The wind worries the loose glass in the window, and somewhere a clock in another room ticks with that indifferent, mechanical patience that makes human fear feel small. I should be calm. I am not. Before I take you further into this night with me, I need to ask you something simple, something very human. If you are here, if you feel that faint shiver in the back of your mind when old words and forgotten warnings are spoken aloud, then stay close. Subscribe to this channel so you will not lose the thread of this investigation in the noise that fills our days. Leave your thoughts and your objections in the comments below, because I am not a prophet, only a man wrestling with fragments and shadows, and I need your discernment as much as you may think you need mine. And if, at any point, this story touches something true in you, something you cannot quite name, then let that small act of pressing a like be a way of saying, silently, that you are awake and listening. The icon in front of me is not rare in the ordinary sense. You could find its twins in village churches across the old world. The archangel standing in armor that belongs to no single century, a cloak blowing in a wind no one feels, a sword tilted downward as if weighing something we cannot see. The gold leaf that once blazed around him is dull now, eaten by smoke and time into a faint, bruised glow. What is unusual is not his image, but the scar that runs across his face, a crack in the wood that begins at the upper left corner and descends like a slow bolt of frozen lightning, passing through his eye and stopping just before his mouth. When the light bends just right, the crack catches the flame and glints like an almost healed wound. I told myself that was all it was. At first, I have been trained to distrust drama. In my academic years, whenever someone claimed to have found a new gospel, a suppressed teaching, some revolutionary reading of the end times, it always followed the same pattern. Bold declarations, thin evidence, and a quiet trail of retractions that nobody bothered to read. I learned to be suspicious of anything that promised too much meaning. Yet even with all that suspicion, something in this icon would not let me go. It began with a line of writing that should not have been there. You have seen inscriptions around icons, those small bands of text that name the saint or angel. On this one, the name is there as expected, a familiar title in old letters, an affirmation that this is Michael, the great prince, the guardian, the warrior of heaven. But when I first saw it, in the attic of a monastery that no longer has a choir or even a full set of monks, there was more. Beneath the main inscription, almost lost in soot, I noticed a faint curved trace of letters, as if someone had once written a second line and then tried very hard to erase it without letting the erasure be obvious. The paint in that area is abraded, the gold leaf gone, replaced by a smear of brown that at first glance looks like nothing more than damage. Yet in the oblique light of evening, the ghost of a phrase emerged, just enough to snag the mind. I remember leaning closer, holding the cheap electric torch between my teeth because my hands were busy, and seeing it clearly for the first time. A fragment of old script that could be read as a warning. Not a title, not a blessing, but a sentence that began with words meaning, "when the hand is lifted." The rest was broken, swallowed by the roughness where someone had scraped and repainted. When the hand is lifted. I have told myself again and again that it could be coincidence, that I am forcing those words into the scars of pigment. But once you see such a thing, it refuses to return quietly to the status of accident. it becomes a seed of unrest. In the days after that discovery, I did what any sensible scholar would do. I cataloged the icon. I photographed it from every angle. I checked the usual databases and catalogs to see if this was a known variant, some local inscription formula, a devotional addition someone had later regretted. I told myself that there would be a reasonable explanation, that perhaps a pious painter had once written a prayer or a line from a hymn, and that a stricter superior had ordered it removed. I told myself this, and yet, as the files filled my screen and the images of the archangel multiplied in their cool digital clarity, the unease did not diminish. The more I looked, the more the phrase, "when the hand is lifted," seemed to stare back at me through the seam in the wood. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to those who study old religious texts in a disenchanted age. In public, you talk about sources and redactions, about influences and transmission histories. You speak of angels as motifs, as theological constructs, as symbols of divine agency. In private, if you let yourself be honest, you sometimes feel as though the texts you handle are not quite finished with the work they set out to do. They are not simply objects, not only witnesses to what other people once believed. They exert a sort of pressure, a slow yet persistent insistence that they were never meant to be reduced to footnotes. It is in that private space that this icon found me. I did not want a prophecy. I wanted a clear conscience and a tidy report. Instead, I received a question that would not let me sleep. You may think that a phrase about a lifted hand is vague, and you would be right. It could be a blessing, a gesture of peace, a poetic flourish. But in the small circle of texts in which Michael appears not only as a fighter but as a restrainer, the image of his hand matters. In certain early homilies, he is described as the one who holds back catastrophe until the appointed time, the one whose presence keeps the flood of chaos from pouring into the world too soon. In later mystical commentary, he is sometimes imagined as the wielder not only of a sword, but of a bridle, holding in check forces that would otherwise devour the earth. When you live with these texts, when the hand is lifted, takes on a different weight. It sounds less like a blessing and more like a threshold. Still, I told myself, I am reading too much. I reminded myself that my mind, like yours, has been shaped by a world saturated in apocalyptic imagery and anxious speculation. We are primed to see endings everywhere. We are primed to read every tremor, every new technology, every war and climate chart and social fracture as a harbinger. Maybe that is all this was. My own cultural nervous system projecting onto an old piece of wood. I tried to put it away. I filed the photographs under a neutral label. I promised myself I would not dramatize a flake of paint. But meaning is persistent. It leaks. It seeps through the smallest cracks. It was a few nights later when the second clue arrived, uninvited, in a form I would have dismissed if it had come alone. I was leafing through a pile of neglected manuscripts in the same monastery, looking for something else entirely, when I found a thin, brittle booklet whose title page had half fallen away. The remaining fragment of the title, written in an unsteady hand, spoke of the last charge of the archangel, in language that did not match the usual devotional tone. It was not a flourishing praise sermon, not a simple exhortation to courage. It sounded instead like someone trying to report a warning they did not fully understand. I will not recount that text in detail now. That belongs to the deeper descent we will make together, if you stay. For tonight, I want you to remain here with me at the edge of the mystery, in this room with its cold stone floor and its single candle. What matters for this first step is that the anonymous writer of that fragile sermon also used a phrase about a hand being lifted, and that they tied it, not to a gesture of blessing, but to a moment when divine restraint would withdraw, and humanity would be left standing face to face with the full weight of its own choices. They spoke of a time when the defender at the gate would move aside, not in anger, but in a kind of sorrowful obedience. You know the familiar images of Michael? You have seen him raising his sword over a dragon, crushing a horned figure beneath his heel, shining in armor atop the battlements of heaven. In all of these, we take comfort in his stability, his constancy. He is the one who does not move, who does not fail, who stands between us and whatever we fear. The notion that such a presence could, at some point, step back even slightly, is not something we like to entertain. It disrupts the quiet contract we imagine we have with the unseen world. It makes our autonomy feel less heroic and more perilous. And yet, hidden in the scraped paint of an icon and the shaky lines of an obscure sermon, the idea of a deliberate withdrawal surfaced like a long submerged stone. As I speak these words to you, I am not claiming certainty. I am not presenting this as dogma or demanding that you accept it as the secret key to history. I am telling you faithfully how the trail began, how symbols started to align in a way I could not ignore. I am telling you that a man who has made a profession of skepticism is, for perhaps the first time, genuinely unsettled by the consistency of a pattern emerging from sources that were never supposed to meet. If you hear a tremor in my voice, it is not theatrical. It is the sound of someone who does not want to be convinced and is being slowly cornered by converging lines of evidence. There is something else, something smaller and more personal, that I hesitate to mention because it feels like the kind of detail people either dismiss or cling to too eagerly. On the night I first noticed the full curve of that half-erased phrase under Michael's name, the candle beside me flickered in a way that had nothing to do with drafts. It leaned sharply away from the icon, its flame drawn almost horizontal for a heartbeat, as if repelled by a gust of air in a room whose stillness I could feel on my skin. In that moment, the crack across the face of the archangel seemed to deepen, the dark line filling with an illusion of depth, like a fissure opening in a rock. I blinked, and it was only paint again. But the sensation that something had, however briefly, recoiled stayed with me. It felt, uncannily, like the echo of that phrase, when the hand is lifted. There are two temptations here, and I am aware of both. One is the temptation to dismiss everything as a series of coincidences, to file perception under imagination and imagination under fatigue. The other is the temptation to inflate every coincidence into proof, to rush from unease to proclamation. I am trying to walk a narrow road between them. That road is not comfortable. It requires me to keep looking, to dig further into texts and patterns that I know will offend both the hardened skeptic and the easy believer. It means that I will have to turn over stones that many would prefer remain moss-covered. It means that, if I am honest, I will have to examine not only history, but the age in which we live, to ask whether something like this lifting of the hand might already be quietly underway. You and I live in a time when the sky above us is busier than ever, not with angels, but with machines. Signals race around the planet, carrying our words faster than our consciences can keep up. Light pours from our devices at all hours, chasing away darkness but also obscuring older, subtler lights. Our species has taken into its hands powers that previous ages could only ascribe to spirits and gods, powers over life, over perception, over the fabric of the planet itself. There is a kind of intoxication in this, a sense that we are finally free of any need for guardians. In such a context, the idea of a divine restraint stepping aside becomes more than a theological curiosity. It becomes a lens through which to read the tension between what we can do and what we are ready to bear. Yet I am getting ahead of myself. This first night must remain close to the flame, close to the icon, close to the man who is still not sure whether he has stumbled onto a real warning or assembled a phantom out of fear and fatigue. I want you to remember that image. A solitary figure in a barely lit room. The dark face of Michael watching from the panel. The glint of cracked wood. The faint ghost of a phrase almost swallowed by time. That is where this story truly begins. Not in calculations or proof, but in a quiet confrontation between a trained mind and an unexpected residue of meaning. If you stay with me through the parts that follow, we will pass through scripture and apocrypha, through the corridors of forgotten monasteries and the bright, sterile halls of modern data. We will look at old prayers and new technologies, at earthquakes and empires, at the way devotion to Michael has surged and faded like a pulse in the arteries of history. We will ask whether there is any coherence in the way his presence has been felt at certain thresholds. We will listen for that phrase, when the hand is lifted, echoing in different languages and different centuries, and we will see whether it converges on a single picture. For now, though, I sit here with my doubt, and I invite you to sit with yours. Do not rush to explain away the unease that arises when you imagine a guardian angel not only fighting, but at some moment consciously stepping aside. Do not rush either to make it the only story you tell about the future. Let it be what it is for this moment, a disturbing possibility carried by a damaged image and an obscure text. Let the question live a little longer before you try to kill it with certainty, one way or another. The candle beside me is burning lower. The wax has formed a small white C around the base of the wick, and the flame bows and straightens as if in prayer. The room smells of hot tallow, old stone, and the faint metallic tang of the icon's worn halo. Michael's painted eyes, darkened by smoke, seem to look past me rather than at me, as though he is watching something in a distance I cannot yet see. Perhaps that, more than any inscription, is what unsettles me most. The sense that whatever this warning is, it is not primarily about me or even about my generation, but about a long arc of history reaching toward a point where a hand that has always held firm may finally, obediently, let go. If that is true, then the fragments I have found are not curiosities. They are advance notices, filed away in the margins of devotion for those willing to read them. Whether I am right or wrong will not be decided tonight. Tonight, all that has happened is that a man who did not want any of this has heard, in the fragile whisper of old paint and brittle paper, something that sounds like an archangel speaking not from a battlefield, but from the threshold of a withdrawal. And once you have heard that, you cannot quite return to the old comfort of believing that restraint is an endless resource. You begin, reluctantly, to listen in a different way. In the days that followed my first encounter with the icon, I found myself moving through the monastery like a man walking inside a dream, aware of every familiar object, yet unable to shake the sense that something unseen had taken up residence between the stones. The corridors were narrow and cool, filled with the echo of my own footsteps. Dust lay in thin, soft layers on the window ledges, disturbed only by the wings of insects that had long since died. Every time I moved my hand across the surface of an old table or shelf, the dust lifted into the air like pale breath, catching the light in wavering spirals that looked almost like script trying to write itself across the room. It was in this drifting, half-lit atmosphere that the investigation deepened without my permission. I had intended to look at the icon again, perhaps take a few more photographs, confirm or dismiss what I thought I had seen. Instead, the monastery itself began offering me fragments as though it had been waiting for someone willing to listen. The library was not large, and certainly not grand. It was a room of bowed shelves and mismatched desks, the air scented with old paper and the faint sourness of leather that has absorbed too many winters. Pages murmured when touched, brittle at the edges. Some manuscripts were clean and neatly catalogued. Others were stacked in trays, their bindings warped, their covers darkened by old moisture. I spread them out on the long table beneath the window and began sorting, telling myself I was only trying to understand the anonymous sermon I had found. Yet something about the arrangement of texts felt deliberate, as though the previous caretaker had left a trail that no modern scholar would bother to follow. One manuscript in particular caught my attention. It was a thin codex, its cover made not of leather but of a rough, fibrous material that had aged unevenly, turning pale in some places and almost black in others. The script inside was cramped, as though the writer had been forced to conserve space. The ink had feathered into the fibers of the page, making each letter look slightly blurred. Yet despite its fragile state, The manuscript radiated a sense of urgency. It contained a commentary on the visions of Daniel, though not the kind taught in seminaries. The anonymous author focused not on the succession of empires, but on Michael's role at the margins of those visions, where an appointed restraint is mentioned only in passing. The commentator wrote of Michael as one set over the boundary that eyes cannot see, and described this boundary not as a wall, but as a flexible silence. I paused over that phrase for a long time. Silence is not an object one can imagine flexing or bending. Yet this writer seemed to think of it as something living, a veil that could be drawn back at intervals and then allowed to fall again. According to his interpretation, the angel's task was not merely to fight, but to hold the silence in place, to keep certain forces from crossing the threshold between what is allowed and what is forbidden. The idea carried the unmistakable echo of that phrase from the icon, "When the hand is lifted." It suggested not the beginning of violence, but the removal of a barrier, the kind of shift one does not see until the consequences unfold. The commentary also mentioned a lost homily attributed to an early mystic whose name does not survive in the records. The homily was said to describe a time when Michael would step back from the gate that has no hinges, a poetic way of speaking about the border of human history. The commentator admitted he did not possess the homily, only fragments quoted in letters between monks who feared they had misunderstood its meaning. Those fragments spoke of a withdrawal of the arm that holds, a pause in the standing guardianship, and a moment when the sentinel watches without intervening. None of these phrases explicitly mention a lifted hand, yet the imagery is unmistakable. As I copied these lines into my notes, I felt a strange sensation, one of being observed, not by another person, but by the weight of the ideas themselves. There is a kind of intellectual pressure that comes from encountering a concept too large to fit comfortably inside the mind. You feel it pressing at the edges of your thought, demanding room, insisting that you rearrange your assumptions to accommodate it. The notion that Michael's role includes not only action, but intentional withdrawal, was precisely that kind of pressure. It contradicted the safe, familiar image of the archangel as a permanent bulwark against chaos. It suggested instead that divine restraint is not infinite, but purposeful, and that purpose might one day require stepping aside. The more I read, the stronger another feeling grew: resistance. I did not want to draw the conclusions toward which the texts pointed. I reminded myself constantly that ancient commentators were often speculative, that monastic writers sometimes embraced metaphors with reckless enthusiasm, that mystical language did not always correspond to literal events. Yet even with all these cautions, the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Different sources, from different centuries, pointed to a single unsettling theme. Michael's withdrawal was not a myth invented by one eccentric mind, but a tradition scattered across time like shards of a broken vessel, each fragment incomplete, yet each shaped in a way that hinted at the same original form. I turned then to the geography of devotion, a field rarely studied with seriousness. It seemed almost superstitious to trace the distribution of shrines and chapels dedicated to a single archangel. Yet when I overlaid their locations on a modern map, something all too familiar emerged. The ancient monasteries where Michael was venerated most intensely often stood along the same lines, where natural disasters repeatedly struck. Earthquakes along the old Anatolian fault lines, sudden storms off the Atlantic that tore fishing villages from their roots, regions where lightning was said to strike more frequently than elsewhere. Of course, one could shrug and say that people built shrines where fear was greatest, that they called upon the archangel in places where the world felt unstable. Yet some part of me wondered whether the reverse could also be true, that the shrines marked not human fear, but places where the strain between forces was already thin. One detail disturbed me more than the rest. In several medieval pilgrim accounts, travelers described a particular chapel perched atop a cliff on a remote island. They spoke of a presence there, neither friendly nor hostile, but watchful. They said the air felt charged, as though a storm were always moments from breaking. One writer mentioned a carved relief above the altar depicting Michael not with his sword raised, but with his hand hovering mid-air, palm outward, as though holding back a tide. The image had been lost in a landslide centuries ago, but the description matched too closely the theme I had already encountered. The gesture of restraint, the poised hand, the moment before it either presses forward or withdraws. I tried, during those long hours in the library, to cling to a rational explanation. I told myself these were coincidences, that human beings love symmetry and therefore invent it where none exists. I argued with myself that the notion of a guardian stepping aside is simply a metaphor for human responsibility, not a literal cosmic event. But with each argument, the counterweight grew heavier. The texts did not speak metaphorically. They spoke as though describing a real shift, a change in the unseen architecture of the world. Their language was precise, deliberate, and consistent across sources that had no chance of influencing one another. The deepest blow came when I found a parchment that had been catalogued without a title, hidden between two unrelated manuscripts. It contained only a short passage, written in a careful but trembling hand. The text was a vision report, one of the many private revelations recorded by monks who lived in austere solitude. Most such visions were vague, filled with dreams of light and repentance. But this one was different. The writer described standing on the edge of a vast plain at dusk, the sky darkening until it turned the color of burnt copper. Before him stood Michael, taller than any statue, but not in armor. The archangel's robe was simple, almost austere. His face held neither wrath nor comfort, only the gravity of one who carries a burden. And then slowly, Michael raised one hand. The monk wrote of feeling the air change, as though a vast pressure had been released. He felt not terror, but sadness, an overwhelming, unbearable sadness, as though something holy and protective had withdrawn. He begged to understand, but the figure did not speak. When the monk woke, he wrote the vision down, in fear that the silence will return before I understand. The final line of the parchment read, "When the hand is lifted, the world stands alone." I sat with that line for a long time, repeating it in my mind until the words lost their shape. The world stands alone. There was no threat in that statement, no prophecy of fire or destruction. It was simply a declaration of solitude, of abandonment not out of cruelty, but necessity. And yet, the implications were catastrophic. If the archangel's role is truly to restrain, to hold back forces that humanity cannot bear, then his withdrawal, the lifting of the hand, would mean that those forces would no longer be held. The world would not end in a spectacle, but in a quiet shift in the balance beyond human perception. That idea lodged itself in me like a thorn. I found myself pacing the library floor, the boards groaning beneath my steps, as though the wood itself understood the weight of what I had read. I imagined, not with dramatic flair, but with sober clarity, what it might mean for divine restraint to loosen even slightly. Not judgments falling from the sky, not horns or beasts, but a thinning of the boundary that keeps the world from descending into a chaos it cannot manage. The removal of a single invisible hand that has held back collapse through countless ages. Yet even as the fear grew, another emotion crept alongside it. Curiosity. A terrible, unbidden curiosity that asked whether the signs of such a withdrawal might already be visible. Not in the wild spectacles of myth, but in the slow unraveling of systems, in the exhaustion of the natural world, in the surge of technologies that expand human reach faster than human wisdom. I wondered whether the lattice of shrines, the commentaries, the visions, and the cracked icon were not pointing to a future event, but interpreting the present. Still, I resisted that thought with everything in me. I reminded myself again that I am a scholar, that I work with texts, not omens. And yet, in the quiet of that old monastery, surrounded by manuscripts that whispered the same warning in different tongues, my certainty began to erode. Doubt remained, but it no longer questioned whether the pattern existed. It questioned instead whether I was ready to see where the pattern led. As evening fell, I closed the manuscripts carefully, returning them to their places. The library dimmed into a deep, amber glow. Outside, the wind rose, stirring the tall grass around the stone walls. I could hear it sighing through the cracks. For a moment, as I stood in the doorway, I felt the strange impression once more that something had shifted in the air, something subtle, like the aftermath of an unseen gesture. I looked back at the table, at the pale rectangles where the manuscripts had lain, and felt a tremor of recognition. The investigation was no longer mine alone. It had begun to move on its own, as though the fragments were assembling themselves. I extinguished the lamp, and in the darkness, a final thought whispered through me like a draft under the door. Perhaps the reason these texts survived at all, the reason they were not completely erased, is that someone, somewhere, wanted them found when the world was ready to understand them, or when the world was too late. The next morning came without warmth. Dawn seeped into the monastery like watered-down ash, a thin gray light that did not so much illuminate the rooms as reveal their fatigue. The stones looked older than they had the night before, the mortar crumbling in long, pale veins. My own reflection in the window was gaunt, my eyes ringed with the sleeplessness that follows a night spent wrestling with thoughts too heavy for the mind and too subtle for the tongue. I had intended to leave the monastery that morning. That was my plan. Pack the camera, return the keys to the caretaker, and tell myself that whatever curiosity I felt was nothing more than academic instinct, bloated by isolation. But plans made in daylight often dissolve under the weight of what has happened in the dark. As I gathered my notes, intending to stack them neatly into a folder, a slip of parchment fell out. One I did not remember placing there. It bore the same trembling hand as the vision account from the day before. Only a single sentence had been written on it, as if the writer had been interrupted. The sky does not tear, it thins. There was no signature, no date. I stared at the words, trying to recall whether I had overlooked this page last night. Yet the edges were cleaner, the ink slightly darker, as though it had been added to the pile while I slept. That was impossible. And yet, in the landscape of impossibility I was already navigating, it felt like one more pebble added to a mountain I had not meant to climb. So instead of leaving, I returned to the library, feeling both foolish and powerless, unable to walk away from a trail that had begun to curve into coherence. The dust motes suspended in the light looked like pale embers, and the fan of manuscripts on the table formed a broken circle, as though waiting for the missing piece of a puzzle no one living had seen completed. I began with the commentary on Daniel again, reading it slower this time. The writer spoke of a thinning sky, a metaphor I now found echoed in the anonymous note. According to him, the sky in prophetic literature was not merely a physical vault, but a symbol for the boundary between the visible and invisible, the governed and the ungoverned. When the sky thins, he wrote, it is not torn by violence. Instead, the pressures on both sides begin to equalize. When the silence is no longer held firm, he said, events on earth will swell as water rises when the dike is pulled back. This was not apocalyptic imagery in the modern sense. There were no trumpet blasts or collapsing stars. It was ecological, architectural, an understanding of reality as something maintained by an ongoing act of divine restraint. If that restraint faltered, even slightly, the change would be experienced not as a singular catastrophe, but as a sequence of stresses, each feeding into the next. I thought of the world beyond the monastery walls, of cities choking under heat, of markets rising and falling like delirious tides, of political factions tearing one another with the desperation of drowning swimmers. Not signs of the end, perhaps, but signs of strain, signs of a thinning boundary. The deeper I read, the more the commentator's insights took on the quality of diagnosis rather than prediction. He claimed that Michael's hand did not restrain one particular evil, but the convergence of many. He described a world always leaning toward fracture, held upright only by the steadying pressure of something unseen. When the hand lifts, the world does not explode. It tilts, gradually at first, then more violently, as systems built upon the expectation of stability begin to collapse under their own accumulated weight. It was a disturbing image. The archangel not as warrior, but as counterbalance. A cosmic architect whose absence would be felt not as thunder, but as the sudden loss of the only beam preventing a roof from caving in. I closed the manuscript and pushed it away, feeling a rising heat behind my eyes, the ache that comes when the mind touches upon something it is not ready to endure. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the landscape stretched in uneven patches of frost and stubborn winter grass. In the distance, the hills rolled beneath a sky that looked tired, as though the blue had been washed out. The wind was restless, tugging at the leafless trees with a persistence that felt more like insistence. A moment later, I returned to the table and opened another text, a codex brittle enough that I feared it would crumble under my fingers. It contained liturgical fragments from a now extinct Christian sect that had lived in the mountain passes of the early medieval North. Their theology was strange, almost hauntingly so, but one detail stood out. They believed that Michael's presence could be detected not by visions or signs, but by disruptions in natural cycles. They kept records of seasons that came too early or too late, of animals migrating in unusual patterns, of lights in the sky that glowed not like stars but like reflections of another dawn pressing against this world. They believed these disturbances marked not the archangel's arrival, but his struggle to maintain balance. One passage described a ritual they performed when such disturbances became frequent. They would gather in silence at night, facing the mountains, and recite a prayer asking Michael to keep the hinge from turning. That was their phrase. The hinge of the age. A liminal point between one order and another. They feared above all the moment when the hinge would swing freely, when the stability they trusted would falter because the one who held it steady had stepped back. At first I dismissed this as mere superstition, but the more I thought, the more its logic troubled me. Even in modern physics, stability is not an inherent state. It is maintained by forces in tension. A suspension bridge does not remain aloft by accident. A star does not shine without both gravity and nuclear fury working against one another. The world, in its own way, is such a system, an equilibrium maintained by counteracting pressures, material and immaterial. The idea that an unseen force might be one of those pressures was not as irrational as I had once believed. What was irrational, perhaps, was the assumption that such a force would never change. By midday, the light had sharpened through the clouds, turning the dust in the library into a faint, glittering haze. I felt the weight of hours pressing on me, urging me deeper into the manuscripts. And so I turned to the final set of documents, a cluster of letters written by a certain Brother Aradiel, a monk from the 13th century whose notes had been largely ignored by scholars because they drifted between theology, astronomy, and something resembling metaphysics. His handwriting was clear but agitated, the strokes long and angular. He wrote as a man trying to capture ideas that arrived faster than his hand could follow. In his letters, Aradiel described studying the night sky from the monastery's tower, charting the motion of stars and the strange, faint glow that appeared on rare nights along the horizon, as though the dome of heaven were stretched thin. He noted that these glows coincided with unrest among the monks, sudden despair, inexplicable arguments, and dreams of standing alone in vast open places. Aradiel believed the sky itself was reacting to a shift in the archangel's vigilance, a phrase that made my stomach tighten as I read it. One passage struck me with particular force. In it, Aradiel recounted a night when he believed he saw Michael, not in bodily form, but as a silhouette of darkness against the stars, a shape that blotted out the constellations with a presence that felt both sorrowful and unyielding. The silhouette raised its hand, the air grew still, and Aradiel felt, deep in his bones, the sensation that something immense had stepped aside. He wrote, "I feared to look upon the earth, for I felt that the world had been placed back into its own hands, and our hands are unsteady." That sentence lodged itself into me like a splinter. I read it again and again. Placed back into its own hands, not punished, not judged, left alone. If the guardianship was not eternal, then the possibility of abandonment was woven into the very structure of creation. Humanity was never meant to be shielded indefinitely. At some point, the test would be real. The restraint would lift. The world would discover what it had become without the quiet pressure of the unseen hand that kept its darkness from overwhelming its light. As I sat in the library, surrounded by manuscripts from centuries apart, all murmuring the same fearful idea, a cold certainty crept into me. This was not folklore. It was a suppressed tradition, scattered intentionally across different eras so that it could be recovered only when the world reached the hinge. A truth too dangerous to proclaim and too important to erase. And then something happened that I have difficulty recounting, not because it was dramatic, but because it defies the thin, rational membrane I have tried to maintain. I heard a sound behind me, a soft, deliberate breath, as though someone had exhaled in quiet resignation. I turned, half expecting to find the caretaker, but the room was empty. The air was still. Yet for an instant, the dust motes swirled as though stirred by a presence passing through them. The sensation that followed was not fear, but recognition, a terrible, intimate recognition, as if an unseen observer had acknowledged my progress and permitted me to proceed further. It felt like the lifting of a veil, or the loosening of a hand. I sat down slowly, trembling. Another fragment of parchment had slid from the stack without being touched. I picked it up. It bore a single sentence, in a script older than any other in the collection. "The restraint ends not with wrath, but with absence." I did not move for a long time. The room seemed to pulse gently, as though the stone walls had taken a single, slow breath. When I finally stood, my knees felt unsteady. I realized then that I had crossed an invisible threshold of my own. The investigation was no longer academic. It had become personal, existential, and somewhere in the unseen architecture of the world, something had shifted to allow it. As the daylight faded into a pale, exhausted dusk, I returned the manuscripts to their shelves. The library felt heavier now, as though it bore witness to a truth that had outlived the men who feared it. And as I walked back to my small room, the wind rose again, carrying with it a sensation almost like warning, something delicate, trembling, and enormous, pressed tightly against the thinning sky. I closed the door, extinguished the lamp, and sat in the darkness, unable to escape the thought that echoed through me with the cadence of revelation. If the hand has not yet lifted, it is already loosening. I awoke before dawn, not because I had rested, but because my sleep had cracked open under the weight of a dream so vivid, it felt less like imagination and more like memory borrowed from someone or something else. It had no sequence, no narrative, only impressions. The sound of wings too large for any earthly creature, the dull glow of a sky that seemed bruised from within, and the presence of a figure I could not see yet unmistakably recognized. I felt the heat of a lifted hand, not in threat, but in departure. A warmth receding, a weight removed. When I opened my eyes, my chest ached as though I had been holding my breath for a long time. It took me several minutes to remember who I was, where I was, and why I had come to this monastery at all. Outside, the wind had fallen silent. The stillness was unnerving, like a held breath stretched too far. I descended into the courtyard and found the world wrapped in a thin, colorless fog. The trees stood motionless, their bare branches like ink strokes against the pale sky. Even the birds were absent. It was the kind of silence that feels inhabited, the silence of a presence waiting to be acknowledged. I tried to shake off the dream, but its residue clung to me like ash. My steps carried me instinctively back to the library, as though some unspoken agreement had been made in the night. The corridors felt different now, emptier, yet not unoccupied. I could not explain the sensation, but the walls seemed to remember the path I had walked yesterday, and they expected me to continue it. On the table where I had left the manuscripts, something new had appeared, a map. Yellowed, brittle at the edges, its surface spidered with cracks. I had never seen it before. The caretaker had not mentioned it. It was not among the cataloged documents, yet there it lay, as though placed deliberately in my absence. I unfolded it carefully. The map depicted a continent, not precisely ours, though the outlines resembled ancient cartographic attempts at Europe and the Near East. The scale was strange, exaggerated in some places, compressed in others. Certain mountain ranges were drawn with unnatural prominence, while entire regions were left vague, as though the cartographer had not cared about political borders or topographical accuracy. Instead, bright red ink traced a network of intersecting lines across the map, forming a pattern too intentional to be decorative. The lines connected sites known throughout history as places of apparition, devotion, or unexplained phenomena, all associated, directly or indirectly, with the Archangel Michael. The pattern resembled the lattice I had glimpsed in my earlier research, but here the lines were thicker, bolder, and accompanied by symbols I did not immediately recognize. Circles, triangles, spirals etched along the intersections. It was not the work of a medieval monk. It belonged to a different tradition altogether, older, or at least far less constrained by ecclesiastical imagination. At the bottom corner, in faded ink, a short note read, "When the pillars answer one another, the silence bends." I traced the lines with my finger. There were 7 major intersections, 7 pillars, perhaps, each located where legends claimed the dividing line between worlds grew thin. The cliffs of Monte Gargano, the caves of Chayafum, the storm-lashed promontories of Skellig, the desert monasteries of Wadi Kelt, the jagged ridges of Mount Carmel, the caverns beneath the Caucasus, and an island chapel whose location had been lost, every site tied to Michael by centuries of devotion, fear, or vision. Everyone positioned along fractures of the Earth's crust, or regions of disproportionate natural upheaval. The map did not explain the connection outright. It simply showed the geometry, a structure hidden not underground, but beneath history itself, a pattern invisible until one plotted not political boundaries, but spiritual gravity. I sat down slowly. The map spread before me like a challenge. I had the distinct feeling that I was not discovering anything new, but remembering something humanity had forgotten. These lines were not symbols. They were load-bearing points, places where the Archangel's presence anchored the balance he maintained. Remove the anchor or loosen it, and the strain would reverberate across the entire structure. I leaned back, unable to shake the sense that the map was not meant to frighten, but to instruct. It was a diagram of restraint, of architecture, of the invisible scaffolding that kept the world from falling into disarray. As I stared at it, the silence in the room deepened. It thickened until the air felt heavy, as though the walls had shifted closer. My breath sounded too loud. The beating of my heart felt intrusive. And then, I felt it again. That subtle, unmistakable tremor in the atmosphere. The same one I had sensed when the dust swirled without wind. A shift, delicate yet enormous, like the movement of something vast beyond the threshold of perception. I placed both hands on the table to steady myself. Something was pressing against the boundary of the world, or withdrawing from it. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. That was when a memory surfaced. Uninvited, unwelcome. A lesson from my youth. A lecture delivered by a professor who dismissed mystical traditions with the crisp efficiency of a man allergic to wonder. He had spoken of ancient cosmologies, of the belief that divine beings held the universe in place. He mocked the notion that an angel could maintain the order of the world. But then he said something I had forgotten until that moment. In many traditions, destruction does not come because a god acts, but because a god stops acting. I opened my eyes. The sentence echoed through me with the clarity of revelation. The map, the manuscripts, the visions, they were all pointing to the same truth. The danger was not a blow from heaven. It was the cessation of a gesture, when the hand is lifted. I whispered the phrase without meaning to, and the sound of my own voice startled me. It was swallowed instantly by the thick silence. No echo, as though the room absorbed the words before they could travel. I forced myself to examine the symbols again. The circles likely represented sites where Michael's presence rested with particular force, places where restraint was anchored most firmly. The spirals might indicate zones where the boundary was naturally thin, but the triangles, those troubled me. Their points extended outward from the lattice, toward regions untouched by traditional devotion, almost like channels through which something could flow once the restraint diminished. It was not a defensive structure. It was a containment structure. The realization hit me so abruptly that I pushed back from the table as though struck. The world was not protected from something outside. It was protected from something within, a pressure, a volatility, something woven into the fabric of creation itself that required constant counterbalance. If Michael's hand maintained that equilibrium, then his withdrawal would not unleash an invading force. It would expose an ever-present one. Humanity would not face a new threat. It would face itself without restraint. I rose, pacing the library, my breath shallow. I felt the fear rising, not theatrical fear, but the cold, rational fear of a man who has stumbled upon a truth whose implications exceed the capacity of language. I returned to the map, drawn to it despite my dread. At the margin, in nearly erased script, someone, perhaps centuries ago, had added a final note. The ink was faint, but the words were legible enough to send a tremor through me. When the seventh pillar dims, the gate watches alone. I did not know which location was the seventh, nor what it meant for it to dim, nor what the gate was. But I understood the sentiment. The gate was the threshold of the age, and the one who had always stood there, who had always held the hinge steady, would one day watch without intervening. The silence deepened again, so suddenly that my ears rang. The air felt thin. The sky in the window had taken on a pale, metallic sheen. And then, for just a heartbeat, I felt it, a warmth lingering in the air, a presence vast and sorrowful. A hand hovering above the world, steady but trembling. Then the warmth faded. The air cooled. The silence settled like dust. I stood in the stillness, my eyes on the map, and knew, with a certainty I did not want. If the hand has not yet lifted, it has begun to lighten. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, I left the library not because I wished to, but because I could no longer breathe inside it. The air had grown too heavy, too charged with an invisible tension that clung to the lungs and pressed against the ribs. When I stepped into the corridor, the change in atmosphere was immediate. The hallway felt nearly hollow by comparison, thinner, colder, stripped of that burdened density that had filled the library only moments before. The silence followed me, but it no longer felt merely quiet. It felt calibrated, as though the world had drawn its breath inward, waiting for me to take the next step. I walked slowly, each footfall soft upon the worn stones. The monastery seemed to sag under the weight of its own age, yet its emptiness held a strange expectancy, like a vessel waiting to be filled, or emptied. I needed air, fresh air, something not filtered through centuries of forgotten manuscripts. So I stepped outside into the courtyard where frost still gripped the ground like a thin, stubborn skin. The sky was a low, opaque gray. It hung over the world as though reluctant to lift itself any higher. I could not shake the impression that the color of the sky had changed since I first arrived, losing some essential depth, becoming not darker or lighter, but thinner. The memory of the note returned to me with a whisper. The sky does not tear. It thins. I stood there for a long time, my breath turning to mist. And then something happened. Something small, almost dismissible, yet devastating in its implications. Far above me, at the edge of the fog, a faint ripple crossed the sky. Not a cloud, not a bird, not a plane. A ripple, brief and subtle, like the surface of a lake disturbed by something moving beneath. My rational mind seized upon explanations: atmospheric distortion, temperature inversion, optical illusion. But the ripple did not behave like any of those things. It was too deliberate, too self-contained, too coherent in its shape. A trembling line sliding silently across the heavens, dissolving as soon as it formed. A thinning. I felt a flush of cold run through my limbs. The silence deepened again, pressing against my ears until they ached. The world around me seemed suspended, caught in a tension that did not belong to weather or geology or mere coincidence. The sky felt aware and exhausted. I returned to my room, my hands shaking. I had no appetite, no energy for food or warmth. I simply sat at the small wooden table, the window to my left offering a view of the motionless courtyard. The world felt paused. In that stillness, my thoughts began to turn not to ancient texts or cosmic structures, but to history, our history. If Michael's role was indeed one of restraint, then patterns of his presence should be detectable not only in religious records, but in the movements of nations, the rise and fall of civilizations, the moments when human ambition outstripped its conscience and was stopped, barely, by forces it could not name. I opened my notes and drew a line down the center of the page, dividing humanity's story into two categories: moments of abrupt collapse avoided, and moments of inexplicable pause before disaster. The first list grew quickly. The near collapse of Rome halted by a dream of protection. The plague that stopped at the gates of a monastery associated with Michael. The storm that scattered the fleet of an invading empire after prayers to the archangel. Cities spared from earthquakes by what chronicles called a hand that steadied the earth. The second list was harder, because it required interpreting silence, not action. But silence, I had learned, was Michael's true domain. Wars that should have continued but suddenly ended. Tempests predicted to strengthen but which inexplicably dispersed. Famine avoided by a harvest that defied every forecast. Revolutions that paused long enough for mercy to enter. Patterns emerged. Always at the threshold. Always at the hinge. Moments when humanity stood on the edge of decisions it was not prepared to bear alone. And now, I thought, looking at the window, something had changed. Something subtle, but unmistakable. The world was no longer receiving the same invisible mercy. The pauses were thinning, the reprieves growing shorter. Every system, ecological, political, economic, was fraying faster than the time it took to mend them. Perhaps the archangel had not withdrawn fully, but the pressure he exerted, whatever form divine restraint takes, was weakening. A soft knock startled me. I rose cautiously and opened the door. The caretaker stood there, an old man with eyes like wet stone. His hands shook slightly, though his voice remained steady. "You have been studying," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I answered. He looked at me with an expression that blended pity and warning. Sometimes the things we find here do not want to be left alone. "I am aware," I replied. He nodded slowly. His gaze drifted past me into the shadowy room. The monks believed this place stood on a line, between forces older than Scripture. They kept watch, though they did not always know what they were watching for. "Do you believe that?" I asked. The caretaker hesitated, then said quietly, "I believe the world is held together by more than human hands." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And I believe something has shifted." My breath caught. Shifted how? He did not answer at first. Instead, he stepped back into the hallway, looking toward the courtyard. "Have you noticed," he said softly, "that the wind has not returned since yesterday?" I had noticed, but hearing him say it aloud made the silence heavier, more deliberate. "It will return," he continued, though he did not sound convinced. "It always does, but—" He paused. "Not all winds are only weather." With that, he turned away, leaving me standing in the doorway, the chill of his words settling over me like a second skin. Not all winds are only weather. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting the weight of what I had learned sink into me. This was not merely an academic pursuit. The monastery's silence, the ripple in the sky, the patterns in history, they were converging into a single truth too vast for comfort. I sat again at the table, staring at my notes, and realized something with a clarity that felt almost painful. Humanity has always believed that guardianship is its birthright. That protection is constant, that restraint is automatic. But what if it is not? What if it was a mercy extended only as long as we remained within the bounds of our maturity? And now those bounds have been exceeded. I looked at the sky again. The thinning was subtle, but real, a soft distortion at the horizon, a fatigue in the light, and I sensed, though I could not prove, that the hand was no longer steady, not lifted, not gone, but trembling under a burden it could no longer carry alone. I pressed my palms together, whispering not a prayer, but a plea for clarity. Instead, I received only silence. A silence that felt like the first crack in a world too accustomed to being held. That night, sleep did not come to me as rest. It came as something more akin to a visitation, slow, heavy, inevitable. I felt myself sinking into it like a man falling through a layer of thin ice, entering a darkness that was not empty but densely inhabited by impressions I could not command or dismiss. There was no dream in the ordinary sense, no storyline or symbol I could cling to, only a presence, a vastness, a pressure that pulsed around me with the ebb and flow of something ancient, like the breathing of the deep earth. It was not hostile, but it was not reassuring either. It felt like standing too close to a great machine whose purpose is incomprehensible, one whose gears turn with patient precision, indifferent to the fragility of human thought. And somewhere within that rhythmic cosmic breath, I sensed an absence forming. A gap, a missing note in a long familiar harmony. The impression hovered at the edge of consciousness until it sharpened into a single sensation, the moment when a hand begins to loosen its grip. I woke suddenly, gasping, the weight of that impression still pressing on my chest. My room was dark except for the pale wash of moonlight spilling across the wooden floor. For a moment, I did not know where I was. The world felt unfamiliar, as if the dream had followed me back, echoing faintly in the corners of the room. As I sat upright, trying to steady my breath, I noticed something strange. The air was utterly still, not the casual stillness of night, but a stillness that felt engineered, deliberate. Not a leaf moved outside the window. The sound of distant animals, usually present even in remote regions, was absent. There was no wind, no insects, no rustle of trees. Only a silence so pure it felt unnatural, as though the world were holding itself in suspension. Then, from beneath the door, a thin beam of light appeared, warm, flickering. Candlelight. Someone was outside. I rose cautiously and opened the door. In the hallway stood the caretaker, holding a candle whose flame stretched upward, unnaturally tall, as though drawn by an unseen current despite the absence of wind. His face was pale, and his eyes had that same wet stone heaviness I noticed earlier, but now something else had joined it. Fear. "Come," he whispered, his voice brittle, as though any louder sound might fracture the silence. "There is something you must see." I followed him through the corridor toward the eastern side of the monastery. We walked slowly, our footsteps muffled by the ancient stones. As we approached the stairway leading to the observation tower, the caretaker paused and turned to me. "Have you ever stood here at night?" he asked, his voice barely above a breath. "No." "Then prepare yourself," he murmured, and continued upward. The tower was narrow, its wooden steps uneven and bowed from centuries of weight. When we reached the top, the caretaker pushed open the small door that led to the outside platform. A gust of frigid air hit my face, the first wind I had felt since yesterday. But it was not natural wind. It felt too sudden, too strong, as though released all at once from behind a sealed gate. I stepped outside. The sky above the monastery was unlike anything I had ever seen. Not storming, not serene, but strained. The stars were visible, yet they flickered with a faint quiver, as though seen through water. The moon's edges had softened, turning it into a pale disk blurred by some invisible pressure. And stretching across the horizon, faint yet unmistakable, was a shimmering distortion, like a crack forming in a sheet of glass that has not yet broken. The thinning. The caretaker whispered, "You see it too, then?" I nodded slowly, unable to form words. "All night," he continued, "the sky has trembled like this. The animals will not come out. Even the monastery walls feel." He hesitated, searching for a word. "Hollow." He held out the candle. The flame leaned sharply eastward, though no wind brushed my face. "It points," he said softly, "as if drawn." "Drawn to what?" I asked. The caretaker swallowed. "To the boundary, to whatever stands behind it." We stood in silence, watching the trembling sky. The distortion grew clearer the longer I stared at it. Not a crack, not a tear, a thinning, a stretching of the membrane between what is seen and what is held back. And somewhere deep in my memory, the fragments of manuscripts whispered, "The flexible silence, the gate without, hinges the sentinel withdrawing." A moment passed, a moment so quiet I could hear my pulse in my ears. Then something moved. Far above us, at the thinnest point of the shimmering distortion, a shape flickered into view. Not fully visible, not fully hidden. A silhouette, tall, narrow, impossibly distant, yet vast enough that even the glimpse of it sent a tremor through me. It stood like a shadow cast by a being beyond the sky, and though it did not raise its hand, I felt the echo of a gesture in the air, the ghost of the movement I had sensed in my dream. A loosening. The caretaker sank to one knee, trembling. "He watches," he whispered, "but he does not act." The words wrapped around me like ice. The manuscripts, the map, the visions, the silence, the thinning sky, all converging on this moment. I closed my eyes, feeling an overwhelming sorrow settle into me. Not mine, but borrowed, as though the presence in the sky mourned something it could not speak. When I opened them, the silhouette was fading. The distortion softened. The unnatural stillness returned. The candle flame straightened. The caretaker stood slowly, leaning on the railing for support. He did not look at me. He stared at the horizon as though awaiting an explanation from the heavens that would never come. "Do you understand?" he whispered. "I think so," I said. "At least, enough to know we are no longer standing where we once stood." He closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shaking breath. Then God help us. We descended the tower in silence. When I returned to my room, the thin light of dawn had begun creeping across the horizon. Yet it did nothing to brighten the world. It only revealed how faded everything had become. As I sat at the table, trying to steady my shaking hands, I realized that something fundamental had changed. Not in the sky, not in the monastery, but in the architecture of the world itself. Whatever held the fabric of the age in place had shifted. What had once been certain was now conditional. What had once been steady now trembled. And for the first time, truly, deeply, I understood the meaning of the ancient phrase, "When the hand is lifted, the world stands alone." It had not lifted fully, but it was no longer firm, and the balance of the age was beginning to sway. Morning arrived like a pale imitation of itself, a version of daylight that seemed to have forgotten how to be whole. The sun did rise, but its ascent felt labored, its light thin and diffused, as though struggling to push through a membrane that resisted illumination. Shadows lacked definition. Colors felt muted, as if the world had been lightly washed in chalk. I made my way back to the library, not because I wished to continue the investigation, but because something inside me insisted that the threads were not yet fully gathered. The tower vision, if that is even what it was, had shaken me, but I was not ready to leave the monastery. Leaving now would be like abandoning a sentence before its final word. The caretaker did not appear again that morning. His absence was unsettling, though not surprising. Men who have carried silent burdens their entire lives do not always know how to share them once the silence breaks. Perhaps he needed time. Or perhaps he feared what further knowledge might cost him. When I reached the library, the air felt heavier than before. Dust hovered in faint columns of light, not drifting gently but hanging almost motionless, as though gravity itself hesitated. I approached the table and found the map still spread open, the inked lattice now familiar enough to stir a chill of recognition. But something else had been added. A manuscript I had never opened lay atop the corner of the map, a thick, leather-bound codex sealed by a strap of hardened, cracked rope. Its cover bore no title, only a symbol, a hand, palm upward, etched in fading gold. I hesitated, and then, with a deep breath, I released the strap. The pages inside emitted a faint smell of earth and oil, the scent of age buried rather than preserved. The script was small, precise, and unlike any monastic hand I had studied. It was written by someone trained not in theology, but in observation. The first page carried a title in old dialect, "The Record of the Guarded Threshold." My pulse quickened. I turned the page. The text described a tradition older than any established church, a lineage of watchmen who recorded events not for public teaching, but for those entrusted with understanding the invisible structure of the world. They called themselves Keepers of the Hinge, a term I had seen only twice before in obscure fragments. Their purpose was not to interpret prophecies, but to document the instances when the unseen boundary wavered. The first entry was blunt. The restraint is not constant. It shifts when the weight of the age exceeds its measure. I felt the hair on my arms rise. The next lines continued. In such times, the archangel stands not as warrior, but as counterweight. And when the imbalance grows beyond what he is permitted to bear, his grip loosens, not fully, not suddenly, but inevitably. I sat in stunned silence. It was not the imagery that startled me. By now that was almost familiar. But the tone. There was no mysticism in these words. No symbolism. They were matter-of-fact, as if describing a natural process. The expansion of metal under heat, the cracking of ice beneath weight. The keepers listed signs of weakening restraint, patterns recognizable not only in ancient eras, but in our own. Unrest in the heavens. Unseasonal wind stillness, echoes in the atmosphere, unstable cycles of nature, human conflict rising without trigger, visions among the quiet-hearted. Each sign resonated painfully with what I had witnessed, the unnatural silence, the trembling sky, the whispered sorrow of the silhouette above the monastery. Further entries documented historical thresholds. Of the 7 described, 5 corresponded with well-known periods of upheaval, not apocalyptic collapse, but moments when the world nearly tore itself apart, only to be steadied by something unrecorded in political annals. The chroniclers described them as interventions not of action, but of presence. One entry chilled me. The second hinge faltered when the empires of men rose in pride, and the skies answered with signs. But the hand did not yet withdraw. It trembled. Another. The fifth hinge approached breaking when knowledge grew faster than wisdom. But the sentinel remained, though strained, and the world endured. And then, beneath those, written in a lighter ink, perhaps by a later keeper, the seventh hinge will not falter, it will be crossed. I stared at the words, my stomach tightening. The seventh hinge, the seventh pillar, the map's faint note referring to the final dimming. The world does not end at the seventh hinge, the text explained. It shifts. It is handed back to itself. And then I read the line that made my breath catch. At the seventh hinge, the archangel will not lift his hand in wrath, but lower it in sorrow. Not as punishment, but as obedience to what has ripened beyond restraint. I closed the manuscript, overwhelmed by a rising tide of dread. The more I learned, the clearer the pattern became. Humanity's crises were not random. They were signals, stress fractures, warnings not of divine anger, but of divine exhaustion. The sky shimmered again outside the window, a faint quiver like the surface of disturbed water. I turned toward it, and for the first time, I understood something with absolute clarity. Michael was not abandoning the world. He was reaching the limit of what he could hold, and humanity, blind to the architecture around it, had mistaken that limit for freedom. I pressed my hands to my face, feeling the weight of an understanding I could not unlearn. My thoughts drifted to the silhouette in the sky, the presence that watched without intervening. That watching was not indifference. It was a guardian forced into stillness, a sentinel bound by a law older than any scripture. That restraint cannot exceed what is permitted. A sound broke the silence, a gentle rustle, not from the door, not from the shelves, but from the map on the table. The fine parchment had begun to curl at one corner, though no breeze touched it. The red lines, those impossible, ancient intersecting paths, seemed to vibrate faintly, as though responding to some distant tremor in the world's hidden structure. I leaned closer, and then I saw it. One of the marked pillars, its red circle faint but visible, had changed color, not fully but subtly. The ink had paled, as if losing saturation. The seventh pillar, the Lost Island Chapel, the final hinge. I felt my breath freeze in my lungs. The ink continued fading, almost imperceptibly. A dimming that the manuscript had foretold, a dimming that marked the loosening of the last restraint. The world, I realized, was approaching the point beyond which it would no longer be held, not in rage, not in judgment, but in sorrowful release. The silence pressed in around me once more, deeper than before. No longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of a presence stepping back. And as I stared at the dimming pillar on the map, I understood that the hinge of the age was no longer theoretical. It was beginning to turn. I did not leave the library for a long time. Hours slipped past unnoticed as I remained seated before the dimming mark on the map, watching the red ink pale with the slow certainty of a dying ember. At first, I wondered whether fatigue had warped my senses, whether the change I saw was merely an illusion born of trembling nerves and sleeplessness. But the fading continued with steady insistence. It was not my perception that dimmed. It was the ink itself, responding not to time, but to something shifting in the world beyond the monastery walls. There are moments in a person's life that split the timeline cleanly in two, before and after. That dimming circle was such a moment. I felt a trembling in my chest, not panic, not dread, but the profound, icy clarity that comes when one realizes they are witnessing something irreversible. something that had been set in motion long before their age, now reaching the threshold of culmination. A quiet question rose in my mind. Had the last hinge already begun to turn? I forced myself to breathe, slow and deep, as though anchoring my body in the chair would prevent the age from shifting. But the silence in the library grew heavier, as if the room itself understood the significance of what had occurred. Even the dust motes seemed frozen, suspended mid-air, as though awaiting the outcome of an ancient equation finally nearing its answer. I opened the manuscript again, desperate for any further guidance. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned the brittle pages. Near the end, a section appeared in a different hand. Perhaps a later keeper, perhaps one closer to the hinge than any of the others. The ink was darker, as if written in haste or fervor. The script leaned sharply forward, each line slanted like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. The passage read, "When the final pillar dims, the sentinel will stand at the threshold, not in judgment, but in withdrawal. Not for lack of will, but because the balance of the age has tipped beyond what the appointed guardian may hold." Another line followed beneath it. "The world will not fall. It will simply bear the weight of itself." As I read those words, I felt a hollowing sensation in my chest, as though the ground beneath me had shifted imperceptibly, leaving me momentarily suspended in mid-air. I thought back to the silhouette in the sky, the sense of sorrow I had felt emanating from it, the unmistakable impression of a presence watching without, intervening. Now it made sense. The sentinel had not abandoned us out of indifference, but out of obedience to the deeper architecture of creation, a structure that even he was bound to respect. I sat back, letting these truths settle into me like slow-falling ash. And in that settling, another realization emerged. If the world was beginning to bear the weight of itself, then every fracture we had witnessed, social, ecological, political, was not merely the result of human folly. It was the result of a cosmic shift in which human folly was no longer being quietly restrained. It was a terrifying thought, but also, strangely, the most honest interpretation of the modern age I had ever encountered. The more I considered it, the more patterns surfaced in my memory. The past decade, perhaps the past half-century, had been marked by a peculiar acceleration of strain. Systems that once endured pressure for generations now cracked under the weight of a single season. Weather patterns grew erratic, storms appearing in clusters that defied statistical norms. Civilizations, though technologically advanced, seemed to unravel faster than they could adapt. Anxiety became a global temperament, as though humanity's collective psyche sensed something that rationality refused to articulate. Now I saw it clearly. These were not predictions coming true. They were boundaries loosening, not punishment, not prophecy fulfilling itself in spectacle, but the gradual cessation of a sustaining presence humanity never knew it depended on. A sense of urgency gripped me. I felt it in my bones, in the pulse at my throat. I needed to understand what the seventh hinge represented. I needed to know what happened when the final pillar dimmed completely. And deep down, beneath the layers of analysis and doubt, I feared that if I did not uncover the truth now, I never would. I rose from the table, gathering the manuscript and map, and made my way to the far shelf where old geographical records were stored. These were charts drawn by monks who attempted to map the world not by distance, but by spiritual gravity. Zones of influence, currents of unseen presence. Most scholars dismissed them as superstitious abstractions, but I now understood they were a parallel cartography of the world's sacred architecture. Leafing through the folios, I found what I sought, a chart of the island chapel, the seventh pillar, though its location was marked not with coordinates but with cryptic directions. 3 days beyond the sight of land, where the sea stands trembling beneath a sky that leans. There were no modern equivalents to reference. The island was not recognized by contemporary maps. If it had existed, it may have sunk beneath the waves long ago. Yet the tradition surrounding it persisted in whispers across centuries. Descriptions of the place spoke of storms forming unnaturally around it, of compasses failing, of a sound like stone sliding against stone that emanated from the cliffs. One account in particular drew my attention. It was written by a wandering hermit who had spent years sailing the coastlines of the ancient world. He wrote of reaching the island after a violent storm had blown him off course. The chapel stood upon a ridge that seemed too narrow to bear its weight. The air was so still that waves struck the cliffs in silence, and above the chapel's arch, carved in stone, was the figure of Michael, not in victory, but in vigil. His hand extended over the sea, as if steadying the horizon. As I read, I felt something tighten in my chest. This description, this posture, matched the gestures described across the manuscripts. Not a sword raised, not a demon subdued, but the quiet, steadying hand of restraint. I turned the page. The remaining lines were chilling. On the day I left the island, the hand on the carving had shifted. It hung lower. I felt a great sorrow, as though something had leaned away from the world. The sea raged that night without warning. A simple carving could not change position. Yet the hermit wrote it without hesitation, as though accepting the impossible as self-evident. The island chapel had been a barometer of the archangel's presence, a physical marker of the cosmic hinge, and it had shown signs of change centuries ago. A question surfaced in my mind, sharp, unwelcome. If the carving reflected the position of the unseen hand, what would the chapel show now, if it still existed at all? I closed the manuscript, trying to steady myself. I needed clarity. I needed to step outside, breathe fresh air, clear the labyrinth of thoughts swirling in my mind. But when I stepped into the corridor and walked toward the courtyard, I stopped abruptly. The sky had darkened, not with storm clouds, but with a strange, uniform dimness. The light felt bruised, as though filtered through a thin layer of something unseen. The air was unnervingly still again, and then, faint but distinct, came a sound, a distant groan. Long, slow, resonant. It was not thunder, not wind, not any natural phenomenon I had ever heard. It sounded like the world shifting its weight, like stone sliding across stone, like the hinge of an age beginning to turn. I felt the breath leave my body, not from fear, but from awe. A terrible, solemn awe. The seventh hinge was not merely dimming. It was responding, aligning, preparing. The implication struck me with such force that for a moment I could not move. My mind returned to the entry in the manuscript. At the seventh hinge, the world will not be destroyed. It will be revealed. Revealed. Not ended. Not judged. Revealed. A terrifying thought, because revelation does not show what is coming. It shows what already is, once the restraint is gone. I turned back toward the library, shaken to my core. There was more to uncover. There had to be. The pattern was not complete. The revelation had not yet reached its full shape. But as I stepped across the threshold of the library, a cold certainty settled over me like a mantle. The seventh hinge was no longer prophecy. It was present tense, and the world, for the first time in countless ages, was beginning to stand alone. The monastery had always been old, but that evening it felt ancient, older than its stones, older than the faith that built it. The corridors no longer seemed like human construction, but like the interior ribs of some vast, slumbering creature whose breath had grown shallow with age. Every sound, even the faintest, carried the weight of something watching from behind the walls. I returned to the library because I had nowhere else to go, not geographically, but existentially. I felt caught between worlds, the seen and the unseen, the rational and the cinematic, the human and the cosmic. The manuscripts, the map, the trembling sky, the silhouette above the tower, all of it pressed in on me with a coherence that refused to dissolve under scrutiny. This was no longer research. It had become witness. The table was as I left it, though the light falling upon it was different now, slanted, thin, tinged with a faint violet as though the sky were bruising further. The dimming seventh pillar stood out like a wound in the map. I sat before it, and for the first time I did not feel like the investigator. I felt like the accused. If humanity was approaching the moment of bearing its own weight, then the question that lingered beneath every line I had read was simple, awful, unavoidable. Had we grown into beings worthy of being left to ourselves? The answer trembled between hope and dread. And so did I. I opened the thick codex of the keepers again, turning the pages with deliberate care, knowing that what remained in it might shape the last steps of this investigation. I reached the final section, a collection of letters exchanged between the last known members of the keeper lineage. Their writing was steadier than the earlier chroniclers, more modern, less mythic, but their fear was unmistakable. One letter, written in a hand that slanted with urgency, began, "We see the signs. They are not symbolic. They are structural." I read on. "The pressure on the threshold increases each generation. The world has grown louder, faster, brighter, yet thinner. Men believe they wield godlike power because they have multiplied their reach, but they do not see the invisible strain their acceleration places upon the architecture of creation." Another letter followed, written decades later. "We have measured the resonance of the silence. It vibrates now, faintly. Such trembling would not occur unless the counterweight is weakening." The next passage nearly made me drop the page. "He is not withdrawing willingly. Restraint has a limit determined not by the sentinel, but by the imbalance of the age. When the weight exceeds that limit, his stance can no longer hold." There it was, again. This sorrowful truth. Michael was not choosing to step aside. The world was pulling away from him, outgrowing the permissions of its guardianship, or perhaps outpacing it. I exhaled deeply and continued reading. A final letter, dated only as late in the 12th watch, bore a tone unlike the rest. It was not analytical. It was personal. We no longer write these records to preserve knowledge. We write them because we are afraid of what will happen when the silence collapses. If the seventh hinge opens, we will not hear trumpets. We will hear the world's true voice for the first time, and we fear it will be louder than we can bear. The phrase, "the world's true voice," struck me like a blow. I tried to imagine what it meant. What voice? What sound? A roar? A silence? A revelation? I thought of the groan I heard outside, the deep, resonant shift like stone grinding against stone, the sound of a hinge moving after centuries of stillness. Maybe that was the voice, or maybe it was only the beginning. A sudden gust of wind broke the suffocating stillness, rattling the windows violently. I stood instinctively, heart pounding. The wind did not feel natural. It had the force of something released rather than something approaching. A brief, fierce exhale from the edge of the world. Then, as abruptly as it came, it vanished. Total silence followed. A silence so complete that my own heartbeat sounded like distant footsteps. I approached the window. The sky had taken on a strange, luminous pallor. A faint lavender glow glowing beneath the clouds, like light bleeding through a membrane stretched too thin. And along the horizon, the trembling distortion appeared once more, sharper now, almost angular. It no longer looked like a ripple. It looked like tension. Then, I saw movement. Not the silhouette from before, but something subtler. The distortion pulsed. Once, then again, as though something beyond the boundary was gently knocking on the world. I felt a coldness slide down my spine. The sky was responding. The hinge was responding. I stepped back from the window, shaken, my breath shallow. I felt the monastery walls vibrating faintly, not enough to be called a tremor, but enough to suggest that the structure of the world was shifting in ways my body could feel before my mind could name. I needed grounding, something to hold the unraveling coherence. So I turned to history once more. My notebooks were filled with centuries of warnings, visions, anomalies, small mercies that came unexpectedly, disasters that ended a breath before becoming unstoppable. And then I noticed something I had missed. For the past few centuries, almost exactly since the time the last keepers wrote their final letters, the pattern changed. Mercies diminished, interventions faded, thresholds narrowed. The world began relying on its own volatility. Not because the guardian abandoned us, but because the world was shifting beyond the design of restraint. Humanity, swollen with power it barely understood, was leaning too hard upon the architecture that once kept it balanced. War had evolved, technology had evolved, communication had evolved. But wisdom, accountability, humility, these had not grown fast enough to match the acceleration. We had become top-heavy, and the one who held the beam no longer had the command to counterbalance our weight. Another tremor shook the window glass. Not violent, just insistent, like a warning, or like a countdown. I forced myself back to the manuscripts, scanning for any hint, any note, on what happened after the seventh hinge turned. But I found no continuation, no prophecy, no instruction. The last keeper only wrote, "If he steps aside, the age will reveal itself." Reveal what? Our fate, our nature, our limits, our survival, our undoing? The silence in the library deepened further, becoming almost oppressive. I felt the weight of thousands of years gathering around me, compressing into a single truth. We have mistaken protection for permanence. We have mistaken stability for destiny. We have mistaken mercy for weakness. And now, for the first time in ages, the world was about to experience itself, unfiltered. I sank into my chair, overwhelmed, trembling. The sky pulsed again. The hinge groaned softly in the distance, and I felt it, unmistakably. The presence I had sensed before. Watching, waiting, not intervening. A guardian forced into stillness while the world prepared to meet itself. I pressed a hand to my chest, whispering into the thickening air, "I am not ready." But the silence did not answer. I did not sleep that night. Sleep had become a memory, something belonging to the former rhythm of my life, the rhythm that existed before the hinge began to tremble. Instead, I sat at the small wooden table in my room, listening to the world breathe in long, strained intervals, as if the earth itself were bracing beneath a burden it had never been meant to carry alone. The monastery felt hollow. The walls no longer held their age with dignity. They sagged like the exhausted limbs of a sentinel who had stood watch for too long. The silence, once merely atmospheric, had turned architectural. It was part of the building, part of the sky, part of me. It pressed from within and without, shaping the night like an unseen mold. Just before dawn, I heard footsteps, soft, unsteady, approaching slowly down the stone corridor. I opened the door to find the caretaker standing there. His shoulders slumped, his hands trembled, and his eyes, once merely tired, now looked cracked, as if something inside him had fractured under too much weight. He stared past me into the room, not meeting my gaze. "It's happening," he whispered. "What is?" I asked, though I already knew. "The quiet," he said. "It's slipping." He pressed a shaking hand to his chest, as if steadying a heart too frightened to hold. "Its rhythm." "All night," he murmured. I could feel it. The balance. It shifts like a beam under strain. And something, his voice broke. Something is no longer holding it. A wave of cold spread through me, settling deep, like winter water soaking into bone. I stepped past him and walked into the courtyard. He followed without speaking. The sky above us was pale, but not with dawn. Dawn carries gold, or rose, or the faint brush of amber. This sky was washed-out porcelain, a flat, unfamiliar hue, as if light itself had grown thin. Then, as we watched, a shimmer formed at the horizon, subtle at first, like heat rising from stone. But this was cold light, trembling through the air with unnatural precision. A distortion, a boundary under pressure, a thin place growing thinner. The caretaker whispered, "Do you feel it?" "Yes," I said. "It feels like the world is holding its breath." He nodded weakly, as if waiting for permission to change. For a long moment we stood in silence, watching the horizon pulse. The air vibrated faintly, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come not from the sky, but from the architecture of the age itself. Like the deep groan of beams shifting in an old house, announcing a change no one can stop. The monastery stones vibrated beneath my feet, a hinge turning, not loudly, not destructively, but inevitably. And in that trembling moment, all the manuscripts, the visions, the fragments, the maps, the entire mosaic of clues, assembled into a single, devastating picture. The world was not ending. The world was being handed back to us. The archangel's hand had not lifted in a gesture. It had loosened in sorrow. The restraint was not ending by decision. It was ending by necessity. The balance had tilted too far for one presence, however mighty, to hold it any longer. The age had outgrown its scaffolding. The guardian had reached his limit. We were about to see ourselves without the veil of mercy. My breath caught as another pulse rippled across the sky. The thinning widened, like the faint, silent opening of a cosmic aperture. And for a single, trembling moment, I saw something through it. Not a figure this time, not a silhouette, not a form at all, but a vastness, a depth, a light that did not shine but revealed. It was not coming toward us, it was not threatening, it simply was, the raw fabric of reality unrestrained. The world stripped of guidance, held up only by its own choices, its own weight. A revelation of what humanity had become, unmediated by the unseen hand that once softened its consequences. The caretaker gasped. "What is that?" "The truth," I said quietly. "Not the future, the present, without the guardian's balance." He fell to his knees, trembling. "How are we supposed to bear it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The world was already answering for us. Because in that moment, more felt than seen, I understood exactly what was being unveiled. We were not witnessing divine wrath. We were witnessing divine absence, the quiet withdrawal of the last restraint. And with it, the revelation of everything we had become when left to our own weight. The thinning pulsed again, then slowly, agonizingly, began to contract, not closing but stabilizing, a new equilibrium forming, one without the sentinel's steadying hand. The hinge had turned, and the age had shifted. The caretaker wept softly beside me. I stood in silence, unable to move. Above us, the sky settled into a strange, delicate stillness, not healed, not broken, simply different. A world standing without the unseen pressure that once steadied it. A world revealed to itself. I closed my eyes and let the cold morning air fill my lungs, heavy with new meaning. The silence no longer felt like suspense. It felt like aftermath, like the quiet that follows a final word spoken by a voice that will not speak again. Not abandonment, not punishment. Just the closing of a chapter too long in the writing, and the beginning of one written without guidance. When I opened my eyes again, the horizon had returned to its pale, trembling normalcy. The distortion remained faint but stable, a scar in the sky, a reminder, a testimony, a threshold crossed. The monastery felt lighter now, not because the burden was gone, but because it was no longer shared. I turned to go back inside, the truth settling into me with the weight of a new gravity. Michael had not left us. He had obeyed the architecture of the age. He had held as long as any being could hold. And when the hinge turned, he released the world into its own hands. The world now stood alone. And we would discover, in the years to come, what that truly meant. As I reached my room, I paused, placing a hand on the cold stone wall. A quiet farewell pulsed through me, not from beyond, but from within. A whisper of the old promise, now fulfilled by its ending. I sat down at the table, lit a single candle, and whispered into the thin air. Not a prayer, but a final acknowledgement of everything that had been revealed. When the hand is lifted, the world stands alone. The flame bowed gently, as if agreeing. And the silence, the vast, trembling silence, answered nothing.